peace was finally won, much of Britain lay in ruins. In June 1945, the country held its first general election in nearly a decade. The choice was between Winston Churchill and Clement Attlee, two men who had joined together to fight the Germans, but now had different visions of how to rebuild Britain.
Any British family, including the most devoted Labour family, if they'd been asked who they wanted round for supper, they would have chosen Winston Churchill rather than Clement Attlee any day. But Winston Churchill seems to stand for the old ways, for unemployment, for poverty, for no medical care, for an inadequate system of education. Attlee was a very much more withdrawn figure, very quietly spoken little man, with very little personal charisma. But what he stood for was what appealed to the British people.
By noon on July 26, the results were becoming clear. Labour had won by a landslide.
Never before have the electors shown clearly their desire that there should be in this country a Labour government carrying out Labour's full policy.
Socialism had never before won so clear a mandate.
The election was really fought on one issue, the welfare state. Attlee had a vision of a new Jerusalem, of a welfare state, of a city on a hill, of a society that would provide comprehensive national insurance. So this is a radical, reforming government which intends to transform British society.
Alongside the social welfare system, the other cornerstone of Attlee's new policy was nationalization. Clause 4 was still enshrined in the party's constitution. Attlee now had his chance to bring common ownership to Britain.
Let's go forward into this fight in the spirit of William Blake. I will not cease from mental fight, nor shall the sword sleep in my hand, till we have built Jerusalem in England's green and pleasant land.
Attlee published a book called The Labour Party in Perspective in the 1930s, but he reissued it when he was Prime Minister and with an introduction that re-endorsed the same points. And it called for complete socialism. And he went on to say that he wanted all large industry nationalized and that small industry could remain in private hands for a time. But his ultimate vision was a completely socialized economy.
Attlee's government would remain in power for 6 years. Before it left office in 1951, it had nationalized much of the country's industry and introduced an array of social welfare programs.
They took into public ownership coal, rail, steel, road haulage, gas and electricity. They created a national health service, free medical care for everybody. They instituted a system of pension by rights at a level which made old age dignified, if not prosperous. I mean, they had a pretty busy 6 years. I don't think any government's ever been as busy.
As the Attlee government put socialism to work rebuilding Britain, the idea was being used for building a nation in another part of the world. A war-torn Britain could no longer support its far-flung empire. And one by one, colonies and territories began to fall away from the mother country. 1948 brought the creation of the new state of Israel from part of the British trusteeship of Palestine. For decades, the Zionist movement had been struggling to create a Jewish state by settling Jews in Palestine. Many of these settlements were collective socialist villages called kibbutzim.
The kibbutz saw itself as socialist, but also at the same time as the expression of a national revolution. And they saw themselves as, in fact, the future Jewish society of this land.
Kibbutz Genosar is nestled along the western banks of the Sea of Galilee. It was founded in 1937 by a group of young socialists, and it soon became the base of the Palmach, the elite commando wing of the Jewish Defense Forces.
We wanted to influence the country. That was the idea. We wanted to influence the country and stand for equality and all the things we believed in.
Moshe Abbas came to Kibbutz Genosar in 1940, when he was just 20 years old. In those early years, the kibbutz did not have tents, so he slept on the grass. But for Moshe and others, the sacrifice was worth it.
The spirit of the kibbutz what gave us the strength to live that way. Someone asked once if I was religious, and I told them I have one religion, and that is the kibbutz. It covers everything you need.
The War of Independence came in 1948, and the kibbutz-based Palmach forces spearheaded the Jewish victory. With the support of the new state of Israel, Genosar began to flourish. It built permanent homes, ran a profitable fishing operation, raised chickens, dairy cattle, and honeybees, and grew crops like bananas, mangoes, olives, and tomatoes.
I had never worked in farming or agriculture before, and I had never had to go by the decisions of a collective. But because what I'd been through in the past, all this wasn't hard for me.
Isaac Rotem settled at Genosar in 1948. He is one of the hundreds of thousands of European Jews who came to Israel in the wake of the Holocaust.
I came through all the camps. Camps in Auschwitz, camps in Cyprus, and suddenly I felt like I was part of one big family. Suddenly you feel there is someone who cares about you, someone keeping up with you.
The kibbutz was socialism on a human scale. Instead of the government owning everything, as it did in the Soviet Union, and to a lesser extent in Britain, the community owned everything and made all decisions collectively.
The motto of the kibbutz movement was borrowed from Marx, which was, from each according to his ability, to each according to his need. There was no private property. Everything was shared in common, but it was all done in democratic fashion, that is, in group meetings or committee meetings where people could present their needs, and the kibbutz would democratically decide what to do to make sure that that person had his or her needs met.
You did not need any salary because you got food in the dining room, you got clothes in the special store. At the very beginning, at least, you had no private clothes. The storehouse distributed every week clothes to the members. You could receive a shirt that another member had the week before.
Like many other communal experiments, including Robert Owen's New Harmony, the kibbutz even tried to reshape family life. There would be new roles for husbands and wives, and parents and children.
Half the kibbutz members are women, and the idea was that they would be liberated from, not childbearing, of course that's impossible, but liberated from bringing up their children, liberated from laundry, liberated from cooking, liberated from all the cares that women normally have. So they decided very early on that it was the collective's responsibility to raise the children. The children belong to all of us, and we are all responsible for looking after them. They wouldn't be under the tyranny of a bourgeois mother and father. They would be free members of the children's society, living with their own age group.
There was a notion of ben kibbutz, the son of the kibbutz, or the daughter of the kibbutz. In some kibbutzim, you even had that when a child was born, the General Assembly met and decided what will be his name of the child. How will he be called?
Ginosar's membership would eventually swell to nearly 400 adults. The kibbutz movement would grow to include 270 kibbutzim, with some 130,000 members, about 5% of Israel's population, and play a leading role in the life of the new state.
They marked out the border to start with, very much so, in the north, in the west, in the south, everywhere. Where there were kibbutzim, there was Israel. And they provided a major part of the agriculture. As time went on, they also produced a large amount of the industrial output. They contributed out of all proportion politically. The first two prime ministers were kibbutz members. The first cabinet of Israel, I think nearly half were kibbutz members. Army commanders, initially all the army and military commanders, these were kibbutz members. And I would go as far as to say that without the kibbutz, there wouldn't have been a state of Israel.
Much was unique about the Jewish state. But in choosing socialism as its strategy for development, Israel was part of a swelling tide. For the nations reaching for independence in the aftermath of World War II, state planning was held out as the quickest path to prosperity. 60 nations in the developing world would eventually adopt some form of socialism. Most were in Africa. The country that became known as Tanzania would provide the world with a leader whose vision of socialism fused the ideas of the West with the traditions of Africa. His name was Julius Nyerere. Nyerere's father was a tribal chief in northwestern Tanganyika, as the British territory was then known.
And when the colonialists wanted somebody from the chief family to go to school, and he was virtually taken away from his goods and taken to school. That was the beginning of Julius.
By 1949, Nyerere had made it all the way to the University of Edinburgh in Scotland.
At Edinburgh, he started studying with socialist teachers who talked about community property, and Nyerere said, "We've got community property, that's what we have in my tribe." And suddenly, it seemed as if the ways that he was used to, which he had always been told were very backward and sort of a source of shame, were actually corresponding very nicely to the most advanced social thought, that is, the ultimate society that people in Europe were looking forward to.
When Nyerere returned to Tanganyika in 1952, colonial unrest had spread across the continent. To the north, Kenya was engulfed in the violent Mau Mau rebellion. Tanganyika was much quieter, but talk of independence was in the air. Nyerere took a job as a teacher, but he found his true calling in politics. He soon remade an old social club into his country's first political party. As the party attracted thousands of followers across the nation, Nyerere kept the title of his old profession, Mwalimu, Swahili for teacher. In 1961, Tanganyika finally won its independence from Britain.